we start with another high-stakes visit to Paris for Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. This time, not about weapons for the battlefield, but about what happens once the war is over. France says 26 nations are now ready to offer security guarantees, including the possible deployment of foreign troops as part of a post-war peace arrangement.
Another Paris meeting for Volodymyr Zelenskyy, but this time a slightly different topic on the agenda for his talks with Western allies. What happens once Russia's war is over? Ukraine wants security guarantees.
26 countries have agreed to provide security guarantees to Ukraine. I think that today, for the first time in a long time, this is the first serious concrete step.
And then there's the question of foreign troops being deployed in Ukraine. The idea is still in development, but there is willingness.
Today we have 26 countries. Some others have not taken a position yet, but we have 26 countries who have formally committed to deploying troops in Ukraine as a reassurance force, or to be present on the ground, in the sea or in the air to give this reassurance to Ukraine the day after a ceasefire or peace agreement.
For Russia, the idea of deploying Western troops in Ukraine as part of a peace deal is a non-starter.
Russia is not going to discuss a foreign intervention in Ukraine in any form or format. Intervention that is fundamentally unacceptable and undermines any kind of security.
US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was at the talks in Paris, but so far there's no sign America would back any deployment plan. It's unclear what shape a European military presence would take. But it is clear the main burden of any deployment would fall on European NATO members. And European leaders have repeatedly stressed that would not be possible without US support. And all the while, Russia is ramping up its attacks on Ukrainian cities. And President Vladimir Putin is seemingly in no hurry to end the 3.5 years long war.
Well, our coverage continues now with Fabrice Pothier. He's a former policy planning at NATO and now heads Rasmussen Global. That's an international political consultancy firm. Fabrice, it's good to see you again. The French president said that U.S. support will be finalized in the coming days. What do you think that U.S. support is going to look like?
Well, clearly, I think the U.S. is not going to be sending soldiers and deploy them on the Ukrainian soil. But what the U.S. can and should be doing is provide what we call key enablers. So the kind of capabilities that are in shortfalls in Europe, like for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, like for also air defense. So provided the U.S. agrees to provide this kind of enablers or backbone, the Europeans have capabilities and have forces, at least on paper, to be able to build a European reassurance force.
European countries are divided on the question of sending troops. The latest polls show that a majority of Germans oppose sending their troops, for example. Could that be a problem for Ukraine?
But I think what has to be made clear is this is not sending European soldiers on the front line. This is sending European soldiers potentially to be in the rear, so in the back of the Ukrainian soldiers doing actually the real fighting. So this is more a force that will be hopefully securing the major cities, major population centers against Russian missiles and drones, but not doing the day-to-day fighting. But it should be a force that is credible enough for Vladimir Putin to realize that the cost of continuing war is too high for him to sustain over time. That's the whole point.
Russia insists that it will not accept Western troops on the ground in Ukraine. We've had the NATO chief saying that Moscow doesn't get a say in this. I mean, how can there be a deal then? I mean, doesn't this make any chance of starting peace talks even more unlikely?
Well, I think we need to turn this on its head in the sense that this is not about deploying a force after some possible or theoretical peace talks and ceasefire. It should be about deploying a force to achieve ceasefire and negotiations. because basically the situation right now is Vladimir Putin thinks that it's still actually a good cost-benefit calculus for him to carry on doing his military campaign. Unless we change this calculus, there is no reason why he's going to sit at the negotiation table. So that force should not be the force after the negotiation. It should be a force, or at least the early stage of it, to trigger negotiations where Ukraine is in a stronger position.
Let's talk about peace talks or ceasefire talks. Zelenskyy says that a meeting with Vladimir Putin is, quote, a matter of necessity. Vladimir Putin said this week, he said yes to a meeting, but he said that meeting would happen in Moscow. So we know that's a non-starter for Zelenskyy. Do you see this meeting happening anytime soon?
Well, I think it's more that Putin is just playing, blowing hot and cold in order to keep mostly President Trump in this kind of ambivalent position. So he plays tough and he's actually still, throw missiles and drones at the Ukrainian population every night. And at the same time, he just talks about possible talks. I think at the end of the day, the key, and that's what they were discussing in Paris, is for the Europeans to show more strength, more steel, for Putin to really understand he's got to be serious about negotiations. Until we do that, I think it's going to be some kind of typical Russian diplomatic theater where we are going to be wasting time and wasting lives.
Let me get your opinion on what President Trump said during today's meeting on the phone. He told leaders during the call that Europe must stop buying Russian oil. Do you think European countries will agree to that? And why do you think Trump said that?
Well, because he's not completely wrong. Often Trump can say the right thing or put the finger on the right thing, but in the wrong way. And some European countries are still buying too much Russian oil and gas, which basically feed into the Russian war economy. So I think this is, the typical European paradox of asking for U.S. guarantees and U.S. support, but at the same time continuing sending a check of several billion euro a month to Russia. So we've got to be coherent. He's got a point. And I think France, Belgium, Spain, for example, are some of those countries that are still buying Russian gas, LNG gas on quite large quantity.
Fabrice Pothier with Rasmussen Global. As always, Fabrice, we appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, let's go now to our correspondent, Teri Schultz. She's in Paris. Teri, we heard both of these leaders talk about so-called reassurance force by 26 nations. What does that look like?
That's right, Brent. And to be sure, not all of these 26 are talking about ever sending troops into Ukraine once a ceasefire is signed, but some of them are. And what was really important for Presidents Macron and Zelenskyy is that they have this plan teed up. That's important not just as a deterrent to Russia. It's also important for the United States to make sure that the White House knows, that President Trump knows, the Europeans are doing everything they can. So President Macron said he wanted to be able to come out after this meeting today and say they are ready. Now, we don't know what all of the contributions will look like. Some of them will be contributing to air defense, perhaps providing naval resources. And those plans are going to be detailed amongst the allies themselves in the coming days, as is, President Macron said, the contribution by the United States, which was not given in any detail today.
Is there, Teri, is there a consensus in Europe on sending troops to Ukraine?
When I just listened to President Macron say that again, it very much sounded like he was saying there is. And I think there is a consensus that some troops will be sent to Ukraine. That doesn't mean every country in favor of doing this wants to send their own people. And of course, it will only be once we see a true ceasefire signed where you know where the Russian troops are going to be, you know where the Ukrainians have regained their territory, you know what the rules of engagement are going to be. Only then will some countries be willing to seriously consider consider sending their citizens into this situation. Macron said clearly that these troops will never be on the front line. They will be, as he says, a reassurance force, staying back, making sure that the Ukrainian armed forces who are in the front line are as best equipped as they can be, and really taking really the forward position there. But I think that the Europeans are very pleased with the result today.
And I understand U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, he was at today's Paris meeting. So what is the message that he was able to deliver from Washington?
Well, Brent, simply Witkoff's participation in this meeting was a really positive signal for the Europeans, because the U.S. generally doesn't participate in a coalition of the willing. And it wasn't so long ago that President Trump was giving Europeans the signal that they were going to be on their own with this. Now, Presidents Macron and Zelenskyy were able to say that the U.S. participation is in no question. It simply is a matter of the next few days before we learn what exactly they're going to provide. Now, that's expected to be air support, whether that's reinforcing an eventual no-fly zone, providing air cover for the troops that are on the ground. We don't know yet, but they definitely wanted to give the impression that the U.S. contribution is not in question.
And we heard the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson repeat Moscow's position today that it will not accept Western troops in Ukraine. Has there been reaction to that in Paris?
Yes, we also heard Secretary General Rutte say earlier from Prague that it doesn't matter what Russia says, that Russia does not get a choice any further over the sovereignty of Ukraine. And I think that's very much what the countries gathering here would say, that, you know, it's up to the Europeans and Ukraine to decide what this eventual force looks like. Of course, we can't ignore, Brent, that all of this depends on what they call a durable, sustainable ceasefire being signed, and that's not in sight. So a lot of what we're talking about now is hypothetical, trying to reassure Ukraine that these allies will be there, trying to reassure the White House that the Europeans have got this.
DW's Teri Schultz on the story for us in Paris today. Teri, thank you.